Good day, everyone! Londononion here, returning with the second installment of our two-part series for the Everlasting Eviscerator. Looking at our agenda for this discussion, we'll first have a quick recap of our build, transition into the anticipated boss efficacy evaluation, and we'll end off with some potential retrospective build reconfigurations. Let's get started. Our Everlasting Eviscerator is led by the Alchemist and has the Gunslinger as the secondary. The Whispering Marble is the amulet of choice, and our accompanying rings are Reserve Boosting Gem, Sapphire Dreamstone, Dried Clay Ring, and Coal Kit Eyelet. This maxes out our Bulwark stacks and allows our Explorer to optimize the frequency of their skill use. According to our build matrix, following an evaluation of function, it was determined that the Everlasting Eviscerator is a kiter type, or more broadly known as a tactician. Damage numbers aren't necessarily the strengths of this build, but instead, attrition. This is mainly accomplished through agility, versatility, and self-sustainability. A major part of keeping this build functioning as intended is through our mutators on the primary and melee weapons. Transpose and Transference buff range damage, supplement reserve/magazine ammunition, and increases reload speed. Due to the effects of our melee weapon, this could allow 25 seconds of the aforementioned buffs with a single successful throw, provided the given target survives long enough. Otherwise, health regeneration is purely left up to the relic, rings, and trait effects, and will only increase if below 50% health. The skills are intended to synergize with the meta of this build. We employ the Alchemist Stone Mist for increased damage reduction and resistance to negative status effects. As for the Gunslinger side, Bulletstorm will put ammo expenditure into overdrive with increased fire rate and reload speed. This build functions on a dynamic use of all of one's tools and can operate both on a close and mid to far range level. As a kiter though, the Everlasting Eviscerator has more favor maintaining mid-range. For a more complete look and discussion on this build, This Onion highly recommends viewing our first installment. For those that are caught up, we'll transition to boss efficacy. For the boss efficacy discussion, primary focus will be given to world bosses, with a secondary focus on sub-bosses that exemplify the strengths, shortcomings, and adaptive capability of our build. Now, there are three categories I break bosses down to. Similar to our archetype matrix, they are brawlers, sentries, and dynamos. Brawlers are melee-oriented and constantly bring the fight to you. They tend to exercise AoE-type attacks, are more likely to have armored hides/weak spots, if any at all, and devastating blows. Sentries are extremely difficult to strike directly, while the bulk, if not all, of their offense is range-based. Their vulnerability tends to have a variable state. They have a greater likelihood of minion reliance, and will force a player's attention on evasion over offense, or what this onion will call a forced trial. Dynamos are a varied mixture of ranged and melee-based attacks. Complicated/attention-splitting fight patterns, map manipulation, and high maneuverability are primary markers of dynamos. However, they tend to have a brawler or sentry edge in their dynamic offense. With the parameters set, we'll start off with bosses that exemplify the strengths of this build. For our first boss, we'll look at the Corruptor. The Corruptor by this Onion standards is a dynamo. The Corruptor itself acts more like a sentry with heavy minion reliance, is distant, and has an obfuscated weak spot while only employing a single but devastating AoE attack. Intimately tied to the Corruptor is the Guardian Minion, which is a brawler. Our Everlasting Eviscerator will have an easy time inflicting damage, exercising its self-sustaining strategies, and maintaining defenses. When taking on the Corruptor, Priority 1 is to target the Guardian, while periodically throwing the Krell Axe at the Corruptor or Guardian depending on distance. Due to the speed of the Guardian and the relatively stationary nature of the Corruptor, this is an easy means of cushioning the demand on ammunition. Additionally, one will have a constant maximized ammo and range damage buff for efficient elimination of the Guardian and its swords. 1 to 2 shots from the double-barreled shotgun will suffice for their elimination. Once the Guardian is incapacitated, this Onion had the most success activating Bulletstorm and eliminating the incoming root moths as early as possible. This would not only create more room for damage against the Corruptor, but will also allow one to take advantage of the automatic reload that comes with Bulletstorm and enemy elimination. Depending on the mod one is using, this can further enhance one's damage output during this phase. The Alchemist Stone Mist can also be used as a precaution where there might be oversight, and their damage would be rendered inconsequential. When the Corruptor begins targeting our Eviscerator, more proactivity will be required to ensure one is not stranded on a platform during the AoE attack. However, our Eviscerator's movement speed is an easy answer to this. Provided one maintains the described strategy, victory is an eventuality. Transitioning to the Custodian's Eye as a second boss of strength. This one is a textbook sentry. It is consistently distant, has a moderate use of minions, and has varied vulnerability. However, it is fair to note that it is also high on devastation with instigate potential and knockdown/stagger effects. The Custodian plays directly into the strengths of this build with an exclusive requirement on range damage. With the Krell Axe, maintaining offense is not a problem, and the attack patterns act as a perfect cadence for skill use and optimized damage. When taking on the Custodian's Eye, this onion had the most success with constant pressure, and this is important if using the Song of Aether mod. When evading the purple beam or enduring a forced trial, Bulletstorm is recommended for maximum weak spot damage, and the movement speed of our Eviscerator should suffice in minimizing evasion time and maximizing offense time. When the Custodian's Eye summons its minions, one should immediately fire the Song of Aether at the main target, and the initial radial damage should eliminate them all, consequently allowing one to maintain offense. With this strategy in mind, ammunition drops will be minimized, but the Krell Axe is meant to answer for this. The only forced trial one should avoid retaliation with is when the blue energy projectiles are being fired. Unfortunately, they stagger and deliver heavy damage. Consequently, one would have to seek cover behind the randomized floor prisms. Because of the randomized nature, one can easily get clipped and staggered into their demise. This could equate to compromised defenses / an exploited blind spot. But with the Alchemist Stone Mist, one can totally shrug off the staggering effect and considerably minimize the damage. It is important to note that this will have to be employed proactively. Aside from that, taking out the Custodian's Eye with this build will come with ease to this dynamic Eviscerator. Transitioning to bosses that test adaptive capability, first up we have Lydusa. Lydusa is another sentry with frequent minion use, remains for the most part distant, and for most of the battle has varied vulnerability. She comes with the dynamic effect of map manipulation and attention-splitting fight patterns. Her degree of distance is what creates a good amount of strain on the self-sustainability. Lydusa is surprisingly mobile and can make timing for the Krell Axe difficult at times. Her frequent use of radial traps and fast projectiles force one to break their momentum of offense and make skill use, specifically Bulletstorm, less efficacious. This is not to say, however, that Lydusa will be a struggle. Despite her high velocity offensive pattern, mobility and stamina are still in one's corner. Additionally, due to our Resolute trait, avoiding consecutive damage from a stagger is possible, but still difficult. Stone Mist should be regularly used where one can predict receive damage from her traps. When taking on Lydusa, one will have to accept that there will be few moments of high and frequent damage numbers. However, the tools of this build pave a feasible path for victory through attrition. During her first phase, one will simply have to chip away at her and apply the Krell Axe where possible for increased damage and ammo efficiency. During her second phase, when attempting to ground pound into submission, one can directly strike Lydusa instead of attempting to throw. It may not grant the overloaded bursts, but it will grant a damage boost for 15 seconds. Activating Bulletstorm is a crapshoot, and ultimately dependent on the comfort of a given user. During this phase of attack, the double-barreled shotgun can be brandished as it will have greater burst damage due to hidden power. Now in this demonstration, this onion is using Hotshot on the Black Maw, and this helps significantly during the final phase. However, Song of Aether is still a viable option as it can reduce her mobility throughout the battle. This build is intended to be flexible, and Lydusa will naturally challenge this. Transitioning to Primogenitor, this one is a dynamic sentry, and forces the Everlasting Eviscerator to adapt with an opportunistic offensive pattern. Primogenitor is itself the weak spot of this battle, but will initially keep itself obfuscated. The main challenge of this battle is the heavy minion reliance. When taking on this sub-boss, Ring of Spears is meant to be one's main defense, but it cannot stay active at all times. It is best used when the main target has been forced out of its vessel. In a battle like this, the Song of Evermod was commensurately helpful because the Primogenitor is nimble on its legs, and slowing it down paves a way for Bulletstorm and a more seamless use of offense. At the same time, Ring of Spears will do a decent job of eliminating the smaller parasites. Once Primogenitor evades, one should take extra measure to build back the Ring of Spears mod by targeting the accompanying minions that fire projectiles. Rinse and repeat, and victory will be assured. Finishing off with bosses that exemplify the weaknesses of this build, we have EVISCERATOR. Just for clarity, this demonstration is the more difficult variation, where the previous prisms were left intact. Whether this has an effect on mutators is unknown to this onion. Anyway, EVISCERATOR is a dynamo with a sentry edge. In all frankness, this boss hits on a rather blatant weakness about the Everlasting Eviscerator. Our build, despite the damage reduction, is still relatively frail, and this is an exploitation of a blind spot. The damage reduction does help, but the level of devastation from EVISCERATOR, mixed with his, or its, dynamic offense, makes survival rather difficult. 2 consecutive hits for most of its attacks will end in one's demise. Laying down the offense is not particularly difficult, but one will have to take extra caution to perfect their timing. Stone Mist may allow an additional hit depending on one's health, but with its limited timing and application, it cannot be used as a crutch. The easiest part of this battle is during the last phase, since it will do the same attack until the bitter end. At most, one has to worry about a series of homing, though slow-moving, projectiles, and an arena wave. He is stationary with a completely exposed weak spot, but is quite a distance away. In a battle like this, greed and a lack of vigilance is the real enemy. Lastly, for weaknesses, we have the Red Prince, another dynamo but with a brawling edge. The Red Prince has high maneuverability, map manipulation, and attention-splitting fight patterns. He makes moderate use of minions, has mild but pernicious devastation, and regularly employs arena-wide spears that can retract at any time. Periodically, he will create an area denial ring for a close-range skirmish. The Red Prince exploits this build with a forced use of shortcomings. Now, as a dynamic kiter, technically this build covers all of its bases, or has an answer to a wide array of circumstances. The shortcoming, though, is the lack of simplified capitalization. The Red Prince does not stand still for very long, and his teleportation makes it difficult to use one's chief means of offensive measures without wasting a considerable amount of time, whether it be through dodging, dealing with his minions, or attempting to search him out as the arena is rather spacious. The close-range skirmish does allow one to use Bulletstorm and the double-barreled shotgun, but as determined in our evaluation of function, the shotgun is good for burst damage while hidden power is active. The Red Prince is not necessarily a struggle, as inflicting damage is not painfully difficult, but the moments of capitalization are significantly limited. Now, not every sentry, brawler, and dynamo are the same. Generally, however, this build will have more difficulty against bosses that hit hard and are dynamic in their offense, specifically with maneuverability and attention-splitting fight patterns. This will now lead us into potential build amendments. Looking first at our traits, Resolute is not an absolute must for this build to function, but this onion considered it to be complementary to the movement speed and quick dodges. However, a viable alternative would be the Engineer's Fortify trait for a 50% boost in armor. This could make bosses like EVISCERATOR more forgiving to blunders and thicken the margin for error. Regarding the rings, this onion considered switching out Sapphire Dreamstone for Timekeeper's Jewel. This would allow a longer duration of overloaded bursts from the Krell Axe. With this switch, it would then be appropriate to switch out the Resolute trait points into Expertise to make up for the loss in skill cooldowns, and having a greater reliance on an extended period of buff damage, ammo longevity, and reload speed. Looking at our prism, Generally, this onion would leave the prism infusions unchanged. However, there may be some room to experiment with increased range damage in place of fire rate, or potentially damage reduction or armor bonus. Whether these would make meaningful differences against devastating foes is unknown to this onion, but these retrospective build amendments are mainly speculative. I actually enjoyed this build, even though this onion would consider it to be on the basic side. Now, I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. My designations of archetypes and bosses is experimental and is consequently open to revision. As we construct and explore more builds, our categories may be subject to change or addition. Otherwise, that concludes our discussion on the Everlasting Eviscerator. It's been Londononion, and I will see you guys next time.